Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, I'm glad to be back. So this is episode 37, and we're recording this on July 29th, 2023.
On this episode, we begin with an update on Ukraine's counteroffensive and its slow but steady progress to take back territory from Russia. We then discuss the Niger coup, delving into what happened, the impact on U.S. foreign policy, and the expansion of Wagner and Russian influence in Africa. Finally, we look at Israel's democratic crisis, with the recent passing of legislation that limits judicial oversight of government power. We also consider the possibility of U.S. brokering a peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But first, has the Earth been visited by aliens? And if so, why is the U.S. the only country talking about it? So, I want to say I learned something very interesting this week. And it was that Ryan believes there's a possibility that Earth has been visited by aliens.
Yeah, I don't know why you're not taking this more seriously. I mean, we just had a congressional subcommittee oversight that held a full-scale hearing with 3 very credible witnesses, one of which made pretty extraordinary allegations. But just the fact that it's being heard in this forum at this level and all the steps that it would have taken in order to get to that level. I mean, there was a lot of enabling legislation before this to make the whole unidentified aerial phenomenon credible to investigate as a whistleblower. So I'm like, what more do you need? I mean, this is some crackpot on YouTube talking about it. This is a high-level GS-15 military intelligence officer that was involved in the program for several years, making these pretty serious allegations in front of Congress.
So I agree that he's the most credible witness that has ever spoken about this topic, I do believe.
In the most credible forum that's ever been talked about.
Yeah.
This is not like, again, it's not some crank on InfoWars or something. I mean, this is as legit as it gets.
But I have several counterpoints. One, all of this is based on him interviewing other people. He has not ever seen any of this himself.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I mean, he's interviewed 40 witnesses and he's handed over all of those names and testimony to Congress for private investigation. We still
don't have direct testimony of anyone who's seen this technology or the supposed bodies. It's just people saying, and we don't know how credible those people
40
are.
People? That's a lot.
Well, I mean, there's like
and
way
not 40 randos. These are people all within military intelligence with direct involvement in the program. But I mean, I think the important thing is that he made, I mean, everybody's been quoting Carl Sagan this week. It's like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And he's made very extraordinary claims, which I think I want to detail just all the claims that were made. The biggest thing, and this is David Grush that we're talking about. So he's the former military intelligence officer that was part of the Navy's UAP task force. Now, one of the things that's really confusing, and maybe you have some insights into this, given that you are a DoD employee.
I'm sure
but there are so many, I feel like each branch probably had its own program at some point, and that this program has now been superseded by one that has more overarching functions. But anyway,
that's not a surprise.
So it's that normal bureaucracy thing. But his key claim was the U.S. government has been conducting a multi-decade program to recover and reverse engineer crashed alien spacecraft. And it wasn't framed that way. The language being used was in possession of a UAP and non-human intelligence. So NHI was like the government, because nobody wants to use the sensationalized language. So he's claimed, that basically the U.S. has had for many decades recovered and reverse engineered this program. I think the thing that fit more with the oversight and the more responsible committee members, I think, really focused on their point of function one of which was AOC. I mean, that was the other thing that was interesting about this was it was a very bipartisan. I would say only China and UFOs. This is the only two topics that Congress can muster real bipartisanship around. But the other claim they made was there was substantial evidence of white-collar crime, misappropriations of funds, essentially to fund this black op program that military contractors were overcharging within the official budget, and then those excess funds were being funneled into these black ops. I think some of the other more sensational items, there was the recovery of non-human biological matter. So basically saying alien bodies were also recovered. He knew the locations of where these craft were being held. This is all stuff that he said, I'm providing to, I guess, Congress members that have sufficient clearance to review this highly classified material behind closed doors. And then, I think it was the other part was the questions around, had anybody been harmed from this technology, but either from the non-human technology itself or from the government covering it up. And he basically implied that yes, on both counts.
Right.
So it was huge accusations, all of this. So I think but to your point.
Extraordinary evidence for sure.
Yeah. Yep.
And there are just some logical problems I have. Like, aliens have visited but not made any sort of official contact, or why wouldn't they want their bodies back, or why wouldn't they just conquer an inferior civilization or just take our resources? Those are just some of my counterpoints. Plus, why is the U.S. the only country talking about it? Because there's this, I think he did refer to this idea that other nations.
Yeah, He mentioned other allied countries. He mentioned almost like a Cold War environment.
Why is the U.S. the only one that always seems to have these whistleblowers or people talking about it? You don't hear like the German government having hearings. And then another reason, how would it not have gotten out? Why? Why wouldn't someone like Donald Trump just tell people? He would have been fascinated.
And that was the point that Ross Doucette
I
made.
think he had a really good article. I don't always like him, but
all those are totally valid points. The idea of a manned craft coming from advanced civilization alone is, you would expect everything to be probes and robots and AI.
Yeah, I don't get the alien bodies though.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that part. I don't get it out. But the other part, I mean, this was so weird in this testimony too. And I don't completely follow the logic around it just because I don't understand the physics. I mean, I understand like at the particle level, the idea of quantum mechanics and being able, like particles can travel vast distances, like light years, and somehow be connected. So this idea of interdimensionality, that was actually talked about in the testimony.
Because
of how they would travel like vast distances. And Grosch basically got into, and it's, I think he has like a BA in physics. So it's not like, I really doubt that he understands fully what even the theory is behind it. But the idea that they're traveling through, I guess, space-time, and that these crafts are appearing out of this additional dimension in our 3D space. And that's how they're traveling the vast distances.
Because we don't have any other logical explanation. We've never come up with one where you could travel faster than the speed of light.
Right. Well, I mean, Einstein's theory says that we can't.
Right. And we've never been able to disprove that.
Right.
That's
exactly.
And then all these. I mean,
we've proven time dilation, which is a key part of this theory, that as you travel faster and faster towards the speed of light, the time actually slows down. We've been able to actually prove that, which still blows my mind that that's a thing. That time is this malleable thing that slows down if you're traveling fast enough.
Yeah, there's too many logic. And seriously, why just our allies have been visited by aliens?
That was I saw Ian Bremmer tweeted out. This is more around where UFOs have been spotted. And it was like his little snarky comment was like, well, clearly the aliens only speak English because it was just in the UK, because it's not just us. It is, UK has some obsessive around UFOs too, but it was almost exclusively the United States, Canada, and the UK. It didn't even include, I think, Australia. It's not every English speaking country. So yeah, I totally agree. But I think what's unique is, the credibility of the witnesses, the enabling legislation, the fact that Congress is taking it seriously. There's, of course, a lot of, and even if it's
proof of anything, that Congress is taking it seriously is not proof that aliens exist.
It may just be a popular vote getter.
It's American interest in,
that's entirely possible. Story. Even if it is an elaborate psyop, or it's this way just for the military to juice its funding by coming up with a new threat. So, that's interesting. I mean,
I like that he was like, so why does the military and government seem to want to make us believe?
Right. I mean, why the DOD, I mean, he went through the official channels. DOD approved that's not a commitment that any of it's true, but just approved his right for testimony.
Those have been made by Congress
only recently around this specific issue. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, and we don't know how credible the actual eyewitness testimony is.
No, we don't. But that's why it would be interesting to see, will we actually see follow-up? Mm-hmm. Or is this one of those summertime lulls where Congress has time? And they were clearly enthused to do it. I don't think it's strictly I think there's personal interest from the people on the committee.
Most Americans are personally interested.
And there's definitely weird, unexplained thing. I mean, the pilots were the ones that have actual visual evidence.
And we've all seen those videos.
Yeah.
I mean, all the experts say that's not proof that...
Right, no.
Not remotely proof.
No, and that's the idea of having a more structured system to capture and document and understand this. I mean, and the whole thing was responsibly framed around national security, because obviously, if there is the possibility of the existence of this technology, from foreign adversaries, which seems very low, it would represent a severe threat. I mean, that was the whole questioning around, could you shoot down this object, which can accelerate and stop on a dime at extraordinary ability? And the answer was no, we couldn't.
For the reasons I stated, do not believe that we have been visited by aliens or aliens.
Well, no, and I'm not committing to that, but I think it's worth
to like drones or something like that. You are.
I think it's possible.
Right.
Yeah. What's wrong with saying it's possible? We don't have evidence either way, but now we have somebody highly credible, and then supposedly 40 other people high up within the intelligence. The only people that would have access to this information or data.
We don't know how credible those witnesses are. When you say
we don't know.
It's possible, I mean, that's kind of a cop-out, because you can say anything's possible.
Sure. But I don't think it's a cop-out. I mean, I think you're talking about it's the credibility of the individuals. Why would they do this? Because the previous people that have come out have been proven liars. They don't have nearly the background that these individuals have.
Right.
And what would be the motivation on fabrication? Or even, to your thought point, what would be the motivation for an entire psyop if this guy's being fed this information? What's the motivation behind that? So even if none of this involves non-human intelligence, what's the underlying in terms of like how the government works? Yeah. What's going on there? See, interesting either way.
Well, yeah, sure. But it's like, I can say, well, it's possible that aliens exist, right? But
now, I will say, I don't think there's any doubt that they exist in this universe. I mean, I think that's almost beyond question.
I'm reading it. I mean, we assume, but then at the same time, it's like, why haven't we seen any evidence of life at all?
We can't even confirm that on Mars yet. I mean, we don't have the technology to be able to look for life.
But I wouldn't say they definitely. I think it's a possibility that they exist. I think, I mean, technically, a lot of things are possible. So if aliens exist, technically, it's possible that they have visited Earth. But it is highly, highly, highly unlikely. I feel that's where we're different. I feel like you think that, I feel like you say like you wouldn't be surprised to find out.
I mean, I think everybody would be surprised. I mean, that would be a big shock.
So distinguish exactly where you fall on this.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, part of it is it's fun. I mean, that's why a lot of people engage in it. And if you're a science fiction fan, of course, you imagine what would it be like if humans ever contacted an
I read a lot of science
civilization
fiction,
and found evidence,
and they
of
usually
it.
take over.
Yeah, none of it's good. I mean, even Stephen Hawking was
right?
famous for that.
Like, if aliens,
this is probably a big mistake that we're broadcasting our presence within the galaxy.
Yeah,
that's a big mistake.
Yeah,
because we do assume the fascist theory of any civilization capable of uniting. It's either going to be the Star Trek, the nice version, or they create vision. They're going to give us cool technology and we'll solve all our problems. I saw people hoping they would solve climate change. Or they're the Nazi type that'll just come and wipe us out, which I don't even understand the motivation behind. If Earth-like planets and material are so readily available, what's the motivation?
Is it unique materials? Or
what unique materials of the universe does the Earth have over?
Conquer people, like they don't wipe everyone out. Oh, that was another thing. If alien, like non-human biological material has been recovered, why isn't it led to like diseases and things like that?
Well, because it was contained in a closed environment, or
we don't know
I
that.
don't know why.
But it's,
were they? Yeah, I mean, they could have contained it, or if people did get disease, I don't know, killed them and contained it. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, it would seem like
I agree. The biologic thing is a gigantic. That's what made this so extraordinary. Here, I'm like, really, bodies? It was, and if you go back to because he was employed with the government through April, and then he quit his job as part of this whistleblowing. And I think the first thing he appeared in was from Dispatch article, which was headed up by the same reporters at the New York Times that did, I think, the UFO article back in 2017. But then he was interviewed in Newsmax. And the Newsmax one, which is the new program that was like Chris Cuomo, so it's a new channel. They're trying to get views. They're the only ones who are willing to take the chance on this.
Also speaks to
but in maybe. But what he says in there, that's when it began, because then it's like he's mentioning Roswell and just all the classic sort of stuff. And that's when you go, oh my God, is tying it back to like the 1930s as far, it's this multi-decade thing. And then the fact that, is Roswell credible? I'm like, okay.
Well, I mean, if Roswell's credible,
because that's the whole recovery alien bodies and all that.
Yeah, I mean, if there is biological stuff, I just feel like they would inadvertently wipe out humans because we'd be exposed to.
I don't necessarily think that.
Why? I mean, that's what we did.
But that was a huge continents. Yeah, but that also required massive scale, like exposure, or a lot more exposure than we would have gotten from, I don't know, two bodies. And at least we knew germ theory. I mean, the Native Americans didn't know germ theory. We would have known germ theory back in the 40s and been able to contain it, even if it did kill people immediately. So I don't buy that. But the whole biologic thing's crazy.
Still spread. I mean, I don't know. We didn't stop the spread of COVID.
Yeah, but if this is super secret ops and they're going to know and think, they're going to think about this in the 40s, what diseases. That's definitely something they would have thought about. Anyway, we'll get way off on that because people get hung up on this.
Well, as you said, it's a fun thing to discuss, although I think you believe it more credibly than I do.
I do find it, just because of this isn't a congressional testimony and it's high-level military intelligence analysts doing the testimony. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I need extraordinary evidence. It was definitely not.
No, I do not disagree with that. So that's why it'd be interesting to see if anything at all comes from this. Yeah. They promise more hearings, more follow-ups, all the closed door stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So on to the Ukraine counteroffensive and where we stand with that.
So yeah, over the past couple of weeks, we talked last about the state of the counteroffensive and the fact that it was being bogged down and not making a lot of progress. And there's certainly been a lot of articles, I think prematurely, saying that this has already been a failure. and just what the consequences of that were and who's to blame for it. That being said, I'd say over the last week, there has been more encouraging news because you have seen, and the Pentagon confirmed last Wednesday, the main thrust, because we talked about before that the NATO-trained brigades, so there's 9 NATO-trained brigades equipped with the Western armor, so the Bradleys, the Leopard tanks, is now being pulled into the fray. So the idea is that they've spent this time probing Russian weaknesses, making very slow and steady progress. And I think that the key mark of the counteroffensive at this stage is they've reached the first group of barriers. There was an interesting video that I think Russian military bloggers showed, and it was probably an unmanned Russian or Ukrainian tank, Russian made, that was just shown on its own going across the open fields, because we talked about how it's very easily defendable area for the Russians because there's big open fields. And they reach in like the first trench. And it just shows it running up against the trench and attempting to go over it, but then failing. And then behind that trench, you have all the dragon teeth, all these white sort of concrete structures. So it seems like they're getting ready to make a main push where they're going to encounter the main defensive line of the Russians, with the goal, according to the Pentagon, of advancing south towards the city of Tokmak, which is the first major city, which the Institute of Wars provided a nice group of maps, as they have throughout the whole conflict, showing like the current Russian structures and defensive lines. And Tokmak is completely surrounded. It's encircled by Russian defensive lines. So this is seen as like the key village to take before they can have a fairly clear path to Mariupol and the Sea of Azov. Now, of course, they reached that. They've accomplished their objective of getting within striking distance of Crimea. So this is really seen, and the Pentagon was saying this will be likely played out within the next month.
Yeah, so definitely something to pay attention to. You know, what I find interesting that they've also talked about in the news recently is the lack of equipment needed for mine clearing. And it goes back to this idea that there's so much focus on the high-tech weapons that sometimes the very sort of low-tech sort of stuff is something that they don't have, right? So mine clearing devices, I mean, would not be super high-tech or anything like that. And that they don't have enough of those shows some of the problems with needing stuff that meets the realities of the ground beyond just having these new high-tech weapons.
Yeah, no, definitely that, and just the artillery. I mean, having the sufficient artillery is definitely not a tech thing at all. And to that point, Michael Kaufman and Franz Stefan Gady, so 2 military analysts that have been real prominent during the duration of the war, wrote in The Economist this week on all these challenges to Ukraine's counteroffensive, and where they focused is just, their inability to scale up combined arms assaults, which by that they mean to be able to just synchronize all these different forces and units, not taking into account even the Air Force, because they have very limited Air Force, but just the ground forces alone. And it's, despite the several months of training that they've had, that's just to know how to operate the equipment. That's not how to work together as a team. And that's something that they just don't have experience in. And what they conclude is that you have to let Ukraine fight the war that it knows how. And the only success that it had, like last fall around Kherson, was this war of attrition, which is a classic way of just out maybe are doing in Bakhmut, because that's the one area they've really had a lot of success in, and look pretty close to retaking Bakhmut, is just the brutal war of attrition of who wants it more, with the idea that the West has to be the production capacity to outlast.
But we have to increase our production capacity,
which is happening on the artillery side.
Well, we haven't really done it on the artillery side. Everything I've read that says we haven't.
Well, yeah, I mean, they definitely are ramping up, but maybe it's not the time frame or in the capacity that's needed. I know they've pushed forward with that, with the Defense Production Act.
I have to look. Just what I've read, there wasn't any major gains.
Yeah, it's still not enough for sure. But I think that's the one area where they are actually trying to.
I mean, that's why we were giving them cluster munitions, is because we
to
didn't
bridge
have
the
enough.
gap until we get to that higher production capacity.
Yeah. So hopefully they'll continue to make progress. But I think, like I said, it shows that some of the equipment that they really need that's not high tech is not getting to them. And it's definitely a struggle. So also in the news this week is that Russia backed out of its Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is a deal that was brokered by the United Nations and Turkey that allowed for the safe export of grain from Ukraine. Ukraine is a major supplier globally of grain. It's been in effect since July of 2022 and has helped to reduce global food prices and prevented some of that food insecurity that we've covered in the show too, that everyone was worried about in Africa. Possibly they ended this deal now because of Ukraine's new attack on the Kerch Bridge, which links to Crimea, but also maybe caused by the desire to get sanction relief on global banking payments and sort of trying to get a new negotiation, and upset by the loss of an ammonia pipeline. So basically, it's not only ended this deal, but has actually launched strikes targeting the grain silos on the port area of Odessa, where the grain exports are sent. And then, as you might expect, wheat prices responded by rising sharply. The price of wheat is at its highest level in 14 years. And basically, the biggest impact is on food insecurity around the world. There's many countries that are already food insecure. This could trigger a lot more malnutrition, meeting the needs of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But I think particularly there's been a lot of focus on Africa. One thing that I was listening to was the kind of irony that, as we'll speak about, Russia has been holding this African conference. And at the same time that they made this deal that's going to hurt food consumption, food being exported to Africa. And so African leaders have certainly petitioned Russia to reinstate this deal. But anyway, I thought that was pretty ironic. Although on the other hand, I think the way that Russia influences Africa through more like military ties with autocratic elites is not going to be affected by whether the grain prices are higher or not.
Right. And Putin did make a big deal of promising free grain for Russian allies. So for like Mali, which recently, as we'll talk about, had a coup, I think a couple of years ago, and is now strongly backed by Wagner, and votes like in the UN for Russia. They said, hey, we'll cover you on the grain because we're that benevolent and great. So yeah, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, not to be framed as allies. But, as we'll see, they're overall not very popular in Africa.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter because that's not
because they're catering towards the autocratic elites.
Yeah. So of course they're not popular.
Doesn't matter, right?
Or
what the average person.
The average person may not like their autocratic elites.
I'm sure they probably don't.
Yeah. So that in a sense, inherently they wouldn't like Russia.
Right.
Yeah. But that's not what Russian influence. Like the U.S. trying to compete on, influence.
Hearts and minds more. On the,
But Russia, that's not the game they're playing. And their game is
legit.
Yeah.
Legit strategy, anyway.
Yeah. So, and I think they managed to have a substantial influence in that region through their strategy. And they definitely can't be counted out. And it's kind of interesting to me, right? Because the US and China are engaged in economic projects and all this. And Russia just is using its hard military power to have its influence in Africa. And because of its economy not being that strong, that how they've had to leverage, their whole claim to being a superpower is just based on hard military power. So kind of getting into some of this, thought we'd begin with the recent coup in Niger that happened this week.
Yep. So on January 20th, a group of soldiers led by the commander of Niger's presidential guard, so General Omar Chiani, launched a coup and overthrew the democratically elected Mohamed Bazoum. And the coup was reportedly motivated by anger over the government's handling of the country's security situation and about kind of corruption and mismanagement within the country. But taking a step back, so Niger is in West Africa. Has a population of 26 million, and it's extremely poor. So it's actually the world's third poorest country. And since gaining its independence from France in 1960, this is its fifth military coup. So it's only had a democratically elected government under Bazoum, who was elected in 2021. And I think real similar to Sudan and its civilian government at the time, a lot of the trouble began when he began to try to make reforms to the military itself. So Bazoum had pushed out the army chief of staff and was forcing other top generals into retirement. So this seemed to be the main impetus for pushing for the military coup. That being said, I think the reason it hasn't met much public resistance is just the expectations were very high following the election. And then because of COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war and the impact of inflation and food scarcity, that Bazoum hasn't been very popular, with the people. So it's probably a little over 50-50 in terms of the split. There wasn't a lot of public protest. What public protest there was in the capital was quickly suppressed by security forces within the country.
Violently suppressed. So, can you really be surprised there wasn't large protests?
Right. That being said, so Niger's actually been a critical ally for both the U.S. and the French around the battle in that region against Islamic extremist groups. For instance, Al-Qaeda has factions within there, and then Boko Haram within Nigeria. So this is really seen as a base of operations for the U.S. and French military, which each have over 1,000 troops within the country currently. So it's a real question on whether this will still be a available hub for suppressing these extremist groups, because it really has, the whole Sahel region has grown to be one of the deadliest regions for extremism, with 1,800 attacks in the first half of 2023 and over nearly 5,000 deaths. That being said, also for France, Niger represents a source of raw material. So they have one of the few natural resources that they do have are uranium mines. So France actually needs about 15% of its fuel for its nuclear plants comes from Niger. So I think there's a lot of concern, especially around the Francophone, so the former French colonies within West Africa. One by one, the democracies there have been collapsing over the past couple of years. And the reason the French troops are in Niger is because Mali had the coup a couple of years ago. So they moved their base from there to Niger. And what you've seen is that, like with Mali, they expelled the UN peacekeepers and have built closer ties to the Wagner group as a result. So there is concern that, in fact, the new leader, so General Omar, actually faulted the civilian government for not joining with the military juntas in both Mali and Burkina Faso when they were taken over. So you can see what his path is. He wants to be more in that alliance and tied closer to Russia.
Yeah, so everyone definitely expects for Wagner to have a similar role as they do in Mali, not only in protecting the autocratic government, but also being accused of a lot of human atrocities, which is not that surprising. So it's considered also a victory for Wagner and through Wagner, Russia. Kind of a disturbing trend. So going back a little bit to what I brought up before, Russia hosted this week its second Russia-Africa summit on July 27th, with 17 nations in attendance, a large drop from the 43 that attended in 2019. So that's a really significant, I think, thing to point out, right? Is that, yes, Russia has this influence and in some ways growing influence with these coups, but it's also rather limited. It doesn't have like popular support. And I mean like in general in Africa, not just people, but its influence is still a little limited. I mean, important, but a little bit limited.
Yeah. Yep.
In general, African countries, we've also talked about this a lot before, have been pragmatic around the Ukraine war votes. So 19 backed Ukraine, 2 of them outright backed Russia, and the remaining 33 have abstained. And we talked a lot about how they're just following their own interests of their countries. Basically, Russia's appeal is to non-democratic elites with the goal of influencing local governments to obtain business deals and access natural resources, strategic locations, and trade corridors. So one thing that we focus a lot on is Wagner's military capabilities, but they're also this big transnational business organization and with a lot of lucrative deals in these African countries where they have influence. So they provide security, but they also make deals in order to access national resources and also just do a lot of business. They also are known for their weapon sales, but as I said, also Russia's security to autocrats. The interesting thing that I didn't really know about is how they also are involved in social media campaigns to target anti-colonial segments. So I hadn't really thought of Wagner itself being involved, but I think so much we narrowly focus on weapons and military and not these other operations that are just as critical but are non-violent. And
yeah, I remember that. I mean, it was Prigozhin that headed up the group in 2018 that I think was cited in the Mueller report that did the disinformation campaign targeting U.S. elections. So he has a history personally, of running these PSYOP campaigns. So yeah, this is like bread and butter. This is just part of their regular offerings.
So I just associated that with Russia, not Wagner specifically.
Oh yeah, Prigozhin specifically. It wasn't Wagner, but yeah, it was one of his other companies that he brought in. Yeah.
So another aspect of this, certainly Wagner's activities are unaffected by the recent mutiny erosion in Russia. So that seems kind of unsurprising. A lot when there was this idea that Russia was going to dismantle Wagner, there was a lot of talk about how it's going to do that and maintain its influence in Africa, where Wagner remains such a crucial operation to it. So I think it's very unsurprising that nothing has changed with African operations. Grosjean himself, it's been just this huge question of what he's doing and is there any penalties for what he did? But he did appear for the very first time in St. Petersburg at this Russia-Africa summit, meeting with the ambassador from the Central Africa Republic. So some other interesting details. They're thought to have 5,000 troops across the continent and operate in a number of business entities. And mining alone brings in $250 million between 2018 and 2021. So yeah, it's kind of crucial to Russian interest. And maybe that's why Prigozhin is not being faced with the sort of penalties. I mean, maybe that's why he's alive. A lot of people didn't think he would live this long. So
no, and there'd clearly be, very limited consequences for it. I mean, I think they're even, it seems like Wagner's fully still operational. They have moved, because I think we talked about last time, none of the troops have been relocated to Belarus. I think you've had a number there. But I think there's talk of, pulling them back into the Ukrainian conflict as well. So there seem to be like zero consequences for Prigozhin.
I think that would be surprising to me, though, if they pulled them back into the Ukrainian conflict, because it seems like where everything kind of went wrong. Like, as long as they have their arms dealing activities and specifically targeting Africa, that's really where Russia benefits the most. And I don't know that it seems like it was the involvement in the Ukraine war that sort of sparked this rebellion in the first place, and why you would necessarily want to continue to use mercenaries in that situation.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's clear like how many took the deal where they became part of the regular Russian military and how many are now in Belarus or went to Syria or the Central African Republic or Mali, staying with that that more expat
Well,
pay.
maybe they didn't have to do anything.
Maybe not.
Maybe they didn't have to leave Russia.
But I think that to the point, I mean, it is, because Russia has very limited resources to influence African leaders. Wagner really is like a force multiplier for him. I thought the Council of Foreign Relations report was really good because Wagner's classified as a private military contractor. It really limits the cost of deploying because you don't have all the additional costs associated with deploying regular military units. And then the Kremlin has all this plausible deniability, but they still can make full use of all the Russian military infrastructure at the same time. So it's just this really cheap and cheerful way for Putin to carry out his foreign policy objectives and actually compete with China and the US in Europe, who spend way more in terms of influencing. Now, mind you, and their goal is strictly focused on natural resources. These countries are a teeny tiny part of like the overall African economy. Because the African economy is Nigeria, South Africa, which Russia does have influence from the Soviet Union days, and Kenya. So these are the leftover, very dysfunctional parts of the continent. But nevertheless, for spending hardly anything and having only 5,000 troops, they have an enormous influence over vast territories and natural resources.
Yeah. Also, I was just recalling their involvement in Libya, and part of the reason why the Libyan I don't know if it's civil war, but why they haven't been able to have a government is because of Wagner's involvement with the most autocratic warlord. And so that's been perpetuating conflict. So they also create a lot of chaos. I know their arms dealing has been important to providing Russia with weapons. So I don't know how much they're still getting, but that was important. And much has been noted that they approached China, but they also approached Turkey and other countries trying to get more weapons sent to Russia to fight in the war.
Right.
So, I mean, it's very interesting based on the fact that there was this big rebellion. No one who's ever opposed Putin in any way has survived. And so, I mean, it's still fascinating the kind of power that Prigozhin has, in that he seems to be operating sort of in a normal capacity.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty shocking and speaks to the power that he still has.
Yeah, it's a little baffling, and it does make Putin look weak. Definitely.
Yeah, so it makes Putin look weaker. And again, just very different. I mean, Prigozhin you can tell, is just a very different operator and a very powerful operator in Russia. And I think it's something that we're all grasping to try to really understand, because it's out of character for Putin and really out of character for anyone who leads any type of coup or military rebellion. Like, they don't usually then just continue operating like
the
normal.
big high level summit within a month. Yeah.
So there's that. That's a puzzle. And in disappointing news for democracy, Israel's right-wing government coalition in the Knesset passed a law that would limit the Supreme Court's powers to strike down government decisions. The law was passed by the right-wing coalition government. The opposition actually walked out in protest, and he said that the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has had its own judicial problems, being convicted of corruption, and so has a lot of incentive to want to reform the judiciary in order to save his own neck. So basically, the problem is Israel doesn't have a constitution. And so one of the only check on government power is the judiciary, ensuring that those powers are not abused. So it has an even more important role than the judicial system has in most countries. And I've long said, like, the judiciary is just such an important part of maintaining democracy in every country. And we've seen it, like Colombia, by not letting Europe serve a third term. And a lot of countries just limiting the power of the executive from taking over and becoming a de facto sort of authoritative leader. So any weakening of that is a definitely weakening of democracy. It's an independent court is seen to need to safeguard other pressures So being able to balance the security needs and the democratic norms, prevent further religious coercion. So from the right wing,
I mean, on that point, I was really surprised because when I think of Israel, I really think of mostly a secular democracy. I don't think of it as like a place with like religious laws.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I don't know how long this has been on the books, but you can't have a civil marriage in Israel. You have to like leave the country if you don't want a religious marriage. Yeah, that was wild. And then public transportation doesn't function on the Shabbat at all.
That's interesting too.
Yeah, so it's just
very orthodox.
It's imposed on the religious Orthodox minority imposes this on a majority secular population.
Yeah, and it's worth saying not only are many citizens secular in Israel, but you also have a significant Arab and Muslim minority.
Oh, yeah.
Existing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other the judicial system is the only line of defense for minority rights. And there's a really excellent essay by a Israeli journalist, Yossi Halevi, in the Times of Israel. And it's a very personal account. And he goes into just the changes and the dynamics within Israel over particularly these last couple of years. But I think it's really one of the things he talks about is this distinction on how the Likud coalition, so Netanyahu's coalition, which consists of the hard right, Zionist, and then the ultra-Orthodox religious groups, and how they don't view the Arab citizens of Israel. There's no conception of a secular Israel in their mind. So they don't even view them as real Israelis, kind of like the whole, who's a real American?
Yeah.
That is the exact same sort of concept. And it's just, just kind of the sadness of that. And the fact that the judicial branch representing that last line of defense, of defending Israeli citizens of their own rights. Under this regime.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I remember when I was doing my master's in Amsterdam millions of years ago, and in the class, it really brought to my attention this tension within Israel, because there were these two girls who were like best friends, and one was Jewish Israeli citizen and one was a Muslim Jewish citizen. And I admit that I hadn't really thought a lot about this Arab Muslim minority in Israel, and it's just been a struggle for them to have equal rights under Israel, and how that's even getting worse for them now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think the other really interesting insight I had no idea about until I read this essay by Halevi was the difference between the European. So, of course, Israel is a nation of immigrants, particularly after World War II and the Holocaust. But you have the European Jewish immigrants, so I'm not going to pronounce this right, the Ashkenazim Jews, and then the Jews that are more from different parts of the Middle East, the Mizrahi. And the fact that there's this like class and political divide between the two, with the Ashkenazim have traditionally been middle class, tend to be better educated, also tend to have all the elite positions within society, versus the Mizrahis, so those that came from the Middle East, are more working class and conservative. And Netanyahu's really, similar to Trump, is taking advantage of those visions that I think have always existed, really played into that, to the point where in this essay, he's talking about some of the rhetoric being used. It's the same rhetoric as white nationalists use, and basically saying that the Ashkenazim, that they wish that they had like killed 6 million more of them in the Holocaust. They're using the Holocaust against Jews, using the Holocaust, that rhetoric against each other. And I was like, what is going on?
That's crazy.
That's just insane. So I think I really appreciate like the level of division. And then of course the parallels to a certain extent within the US, or maybe foreshadowing, I don't know. But it was really eye-opening. What you mentioned, I got a conception of the Muslim and the Jew, but then I think of the Jewish as like this homogenous. I got like the ultra-Orthodox, but I didn't get this whole European Jews from Europe and then Jews from the Middle East, and like this huge division and hatred that Netanyahu's really stoked around this issue.
Yeah, and we talked about Israel before and what this right-wing coalition how that might change how Netanyahu governs Israel. And we're definitely seeing the effects of that because in his previous governments, he was forced to be a lot more moderate. Mm-hmm. But now with the success of these more ultra-conservative populists having to lean toward their side and toward a ruling power, we can see the negative effects of that and how it's very negative for democracy itself. Now, one thing that they did not do that's still really important to mention is that one thing they've talked about is the government being able to appoint judges and remove judges whenever they want. And so the good thing is that hasn't passed. Mm-hmm. They haven't done that. So it still maintains an independent judiciary, but just ones whose powers are heavily clipped. If they destroy the independence of the judiciary, then that would be a really serious problem, democratic breach.
Right, yeah, yeah.
So fortunately, they haven't pursued that so far, but who knows what comes next.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. I mean, it really has been a resurgence of the more secular liberal, in terms of like the scale of the protests that mm-hmm. are going on, like in mm-hmm. Tel Aviv, and they had a big march from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this real conscious effort, too, of not letting the far right take the patriotic mm-hmm. emblem. So using like these just like huge streams of Israeli flags and a lot of testimony. And because, I mean, I think it is different in the sense that everybody has to serve. Mm-hmm. And there is this feeling of defense and patriotism and generations, their parents, their grandparents who fought in these numerous wars against Arab nations for the survival of their country, and then have relatives that died in the Holocaust. It's like this very visceral sort of thing. So seeing them push back and defend the country of how they think of it is heartening, but also, yeah, sad that despite that, they still have all this. It's not clear like how long or whether or when the next election will be.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting during the protest is that a lot of people serving in the military were mm-hmm. protesting and saying that they wouldn't show up to work.
Yeah, yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. If that's actually true, would they be arrested? So I have a feeling it's a minority that won't be that significant, but it definitely could be.
Yeah, yeah. So then I think the final thing was, of course, we had to have our boy Thomas Friedman kind of ride in with his little Deus Ex Machina supposed solution that all this was magically going to be solved and we'd be able to stick it to China because because the U.S. is getting ready to broker a gigantic deal with Saudi Arabia, which is, I mean, they have sent out at least feelers. And of course, his article it's like, oh, this isn't going to be immediate, but just imagine the possibilities if we can broker this deal with Saudi Arabia, which had a number of different elements. But one key part was the formal recognition of Israel. But then in exchange for that, essentially what the thought of what Saudi Arabia is asking for is a NATO-like commitment from the U.S. for its mm-hmm. defense, which I'm like, okay, this could be real popular within Congress. But then Israel would also have to go back to the earlier agreements around like the West Bank and around settlements and a two-state solution. But in exchange, if you had formal recognition from Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Sunni Gulf states, that essentially that would defang a lot of the driving impetus for mm-hmm. the far right within Israel. That was the theory around it.
So one of the conditions, of course, is that they would have to end settlements in the West Bank, pull back settlements from the West Bank, and guarantee that there will be no even unauthorized settlements built there. So one of my favorite quotes from Friedman was just doesn't sound right to me. It's like, I'd love to see Israel's far-right finance minister go on Israeli television and explain to the Israeli people why it is in Israel's interest to annex the West Bank with its 2.9 million Palestinian inhabitants forever, rather than normalize ties with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Muslim world. And I read this and I was like, you fundamentally don't understand populism. it's just popular will, the way that they feel about the West Bank. No one's like weighing this with a deal with Saudi Arabia. And for populists, yes, annexing the West Bank is still probably going to be a lot more popular than a Saudi Arabia-Israeli deal.
Yeah, and they're not going to see, they're like, well, how does this gain our security? I mean, Hamas is being funded by Iran. This doesn't affect Iran's ability. And then you have the religious, they're like, well, we're religiously ordained to have this territory. This is that you're not going to reason with those people at all.
So he just doesn't understand populism.
Yeah, he doesn't understand that. And then, I mean, I thought going back to this Halevi article, I mean, one of the things on what motivated the far right so much is you had this pullback from Gaza in 2005, and they had to forcibly remove these settlers from their houses, and didn't, in his take of it, didn't support them in resettling elsewhere or in rebuilding their lives. And that's really driven this group. They want revenge for that. And that's the reason they hate the liberal state as well. So why are they going to, I mean, just from that history, there's no way in hell that group's going to compromise.
This group is in control of the government.
Right.
Why in the world we expect them to agree to some kind of deal? And the more I read this article about what would have to happen, the more I was like, oh, this is really not going to happen. They're talking about transferring some of the Palestinian population from Area C in the West Bank under full Israeli control to areas B and C I mean, just all these sort of things that having a right-wing government is never going to happen. And so what is incentive for them?
Yeah, the only thing would be the U.S. would have to lay the hammer down, which I don't see it doing.
How could it even do that?
Full cut off of aid.
It's
going
never
as far as... Yeah. And then, I mean, the other complexity then is also, this has to pass the Senate. This is like a formal, so Saudi Arabia is widely hated within the country. And I think we question more and more our strategic relationship with them, other than denying China. And we've talked about before, that's not, I mean, Saudi Arabia is using China as leverage to get a NATO-like deal, which would be a real coup for them. But yeah, the idea of passing
security
the Senate,
commitments from China and the Middle East, although that would never compare.
That's not going to be,
yeah. But I mean, Chinese influence is real, and you're not going to get rid of that influence. I mean, the money that's involved in that. And
but I also don't think U.S. influence is really under threat because of the defensive commitments, the military equipment, all the things already tied, deeply embedded.
Right, but we're not offering anything new to them, and China's offering new things.
Yeah, but I think they can't afford to re-switch out like all their equipment.
Right.
You have that embedded military technology. Yes. Yeah.
But influence and otherwise.
Right.
Yeah, China gets to offer them things like ours is baked in. There's nothing new that we're going to offer.
Well, I mean, the other parts of this deal, besides the NATO-like commitment, is giving them the THAAD missile defense, which they want because of Iran. It would neutralize Iran's medium-range missiles. And I think access to some other military tech. So that's what they're pushing for.
And then there's also that the Palestinian Authority, Friedman says, would have to take part in this. But then he admits they're kind of
they're a mess. Yeah.
They're a mess. And so they can't engage in peace talks with Israel today.
Right.
So in sum, for some reason,
it's a slam dunk. That's what you mean.
Israel's right-wing government is going to commit to these sort of liberal ideas of not annexing the West Bank and all these other elements. So somehow the right wing is going to go against its own popular interest. Then the United States would have to pass it in Congress, which is unlikely. And then the Palestinian Authority would have to be part of this process. And that's not likely to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think
all three parts.
Yeah, and to be fair, Friedman did mention that Saudi Arabia would have to cut a gigantic check to the Palestinian Authority, which maybe helps them get less dysfunctional, like being better funded. I don't know. They did mention that as part of it. But yeah, to your point.
So there's three key elements, and all of them are extraordinarily unlikely. So the only thing that this article helped me see is just how unlikely the Israel-Saudi Arabia deal is. I mean, previously, I thought it was unlikely, but I didn't know all the reasons why it was unlikely. And now I understand why this is not going to happen.
Yeah, it's too many pieces. Because I think the other thing, going back to the congressional approval, was there's no way Senate Democrats are going to vote for it unless there is the two-state solution. But then
the right
wing in Israel, his entire government and the coalition depends on, this religious fervor for manifest destiny of occupying all of the Palestinian territory.
So it's ironic that he's writing an article to convince people
Isn't he supposed to be an expert on the Middle East? Isn't this his area of specialty?
And really, his entire argument convinced me to the opposite, that there's no chance of this happening, that there's too many parts that have to happen, and they're all such long shots. And the fact that all three of them would happen, this is not going to happen. I'm sure the Biden administration would love to have this deal.
Oh, yeah. That'd be a huge win.
I think you had convinced me in the past that this is more likely until I read this article. And then I was like, nope.
Well, then and you see the direction the Israeli government has gone down and just what it's really capable and composed of. And that makes it seems like dead on arrival right there. Under a different Israeli government, or even the one, when this is first being talked about in the Trump administration, I think it's possible. This one, no.
Yeah.
No.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It would still be extraordinarily a long shot under the government previous to this. But now it seems impossible.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think this brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me, A.R. Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Anita at kelloggglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for any of the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like the show, please take the time to tell your friends, share it on your social sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.